Hello and welcome. This is the first of a series of short yarns written by James R. Curl. These stories were inspired by his favorite author, the late great Robert E. Howard. The first story is The Dark Entity. I hope you enjoy it. 1. The pirate ship Hell's Fury swayed and pitched drunkenly as it drifted on the swells. Its steersman, having died with an arrow through his throat, lay where he had fallen, his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the blue-tinged sky. With no one at the wheel, the ship had lost headway and was now at the mercy of the sea. It had been a swift yet bloody fight between the men of Sea Rover and its nemesis, Hell's Fury. The ghastly harvest of dead that littered the blood-soaked deck could attest to that. Most had been hacked to pieces in the furious battle, while others had died during the quick exchange of arrows that preceded the hand-to-hand combat. And now, as the clangor of battle ceased and the moans of the dying faded, two men yet lived, the lone survivors of the violent clash. Standing on the deck of Hell's Fury, legs braced far apart, the two men faced each other, the lurid fire of hate flaming brightly in their smoldering eyes. Each man bore marks of the brutal encounter, their gray coats of chainmail hanging in sagging tatters, their limbs crisscrossed with wounds, and their cutlasses stained red with blood. Both were tall men with broad shoulders, lean, iron-hard muscles, and skin that had been bronzed by the sun. But that was where the similarities ended. Whereas Captain Graves was clean-shaven and bald with steel-gray eyes, Captain Killoran had a mass of curly black hair, a black beard, and equally black eyes. In demeanor, there was also a noticeable contrast. Though both men been hardened by a life of violence and bloodshed, Captain Killoran exuded an evil aura. His heavy brow and dark brooding eyes hinted at the sinister and innate cruelty that lurked within his soul. This evil could not be blamed on the life he had led. It was a characteristic born unto him. Conversely, there was nothing in the appearance of Captain Graves to suggest a wholly evil nature. Yet, to be sure, he was no gentleman pirate. As the two men glared at each other with eyes blazing, the deck heaved and foamy seawater lapped over its sides, mixing with fresh blood. The unsteady ship bothered the men little, for they were born pirates and accustomed to the turbulence of the ocean. "This is where you meet your death, on the deck of my own ship," said Killoran in a voice thick with malice. "The only death that comes this day will be yours," snapped Graves. And with the speed of a striking cobra, he stabbed with his cutlass. Only Killoran's quick reflexes saved him from a severed neck in that instant. With a deft movement, he parried the thrust and with a wolfish snarl cut back at his enemy. What followed was a savage whirlwind of thrusts, parries, and cuts far too fast for the eye to follow. Both men were famed swordsmen of notorious repute, veterans of 100 battles on sea and land. Near equals in skill, the fight raged back and forth for several moments, its outcome uncertain. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. Gasping, Killoran staggered back, clutching his crimson chest, his lips writhing in agony as his sword dropped to the deck with a clang from nerveless fingers. With all the might of his steely muscles, Graves plunged his cutlass through his enemy's heart. Pulling his dripping blade free, he watched as Killoran, grim to the last, sank to his knees in silence and died in a widening pool of blood. Sheathing his blade, Graves rested for a moment as the madness of the fight faded. He was weary, and his limbs ached from a multitude of wounds, though for a man of his profession, such injuries were commonplace. And thanks to his chainmail armor, none of them were life-threatening. Looking around, he spotted a discarded wine jug and from it drank deeply. The sweet crimson liquid was like a magical elixir and did much to restore his strength and ease his pains. Wiping his lips with the back of his hand, the pirate surveyed his surroundings. Without a steersman, Hell's Fury had gone adrift, swiftly being pulled by the currents towards the shore. Desperate not to run aground, Graves hurriedly dropped the massive iron anchor, its chain rattling loudly as it unraveled and hit the water with a resounding splash. With Hell's Fury secured, Graves caught a glimpse of his own ship. By now it had been nearly swallowed by the ocean swells. Only the crow's nest and a portion of white cloth sails could yet be seen as it slowly sank to its final resting place. She had been a fine ship and a fine crew, thought the pirate. And it was with more than a little regret that he watched his beloved sea rover disappear below the crystal blue waters. A subsequent search of the ship he now occupied confirmed for the pirate that he was indeed the sole survivor. For a moment he contemplated his situation. He felt confident that he could limp Hell's Fury back to the mainland by himself, though it would be no easy task, and the going would be slow. Well, he thought to himself, at least the cargo holds are crammed full of dried food and fresh water. He then glanced at the island. The lure of the vast treasure that was said to rest there weighed heavy on the captain's mind. Having traveled so far and lost so much, he knew that he could not leave without at least a cursory look at what the island might hold. Having consigned himself to head ashore, Graves discarded his torn mail coat and exchanged it for a fresh one taken from a corpse. From another body he took a wickedly curved 2-foot Zajar knife, a weapon common among pirates and well known for its ability to disembowel a man with an upward slash. Better to be armed to the teeth, thought the pirate as he buckled it next to his cutlass. The captain then turned his attention to the dead. He could not leave the bodies to rot, and so, one by one, he heaved them overboard, each one sinking to a cold, watery grave. A short time later, he had lowered one of the dinghies and clambered down to it. Hitching the oars, he pulled hard, sending the small craft speeding towards the island. As he rowed rhythmically, he reflected back on the events that had led up to his current plight. Less than a week before, he had been in the port city of Kem carousing, when Kylan, his second-in-command, approached him. "Captain, I have just heard something from a loose tongue that may interest you. Apparently, Killerin has obtained coordinates that lead to the lost island of Maru. He expects to set sail at first light." This bit of news piqued the captain's interest. He was well aware of the legendary and half-mythical island. Rumors told of a fabulous treasure of unimaginable wealth that rested there. The island was also said to have been home to the fierce and terrible Ramas, an ancient race of powerful warrior wizards. In the years of their plundering and conquering, they amassed great spoils of treasure and vast knowledge of arcane thaumaturgy and ritualistic magic. And as their understanding grew, they delved ever deeper into their dark, sorcerous arts. But alas, their conjurings brought forth beings from beyond the realm of humankind. These unnatural things brought about the destruction of the Ramas and their great empire, with all but a handful escaping. All of these thoughts flashed through the captain's mind in an instant as he recalled the stories he had heard over the years. "Maru?" he said incredulously as he gazed at his first mate, his face plainly showing his skepticism. "That island is but a fable, a bedtime story told to children. Pirates and adventurers have been searching for it for centuries, and most who went to nab its treasure never returned. And those who did found naught but the endless blue ocean and monstrous creatures that dwell within its depths." "True, Captain," replied Kylan, "but this time may be different. The man I spoke with is one of Killerin's spies. He claims that he gazed upon a map that had been stolen from a sorcerer, who in turn took it from a moldering corpse in a long-forgotten crypt. The occupant of that crypt was alleged to be the last descendant of the Ramas." This last bit of information elicited an instant reaction from the captain, and his eyes widened in interest. "Tell me, Kylan," he queried, "were you able to learn the island's whereabouts from this spy?" "Aye, Captain. It took more than a little wine and a few silver coins to bribe him, but I was able to persuade him to tell me the coordinates." "Then," said Graves, "if that black-bearded dog means to sail for the island, we will follow." Graves took a long draught of his foamy ale and wiped away the froth with the back of his hand. We will waylay Kilrin on the island or run him down on the open sea and take the loot for ourselves." Without conscious thought, the captain's hand closed on his sword's well-worn hilt. "As you know," he continued, a flash of anger coming to his gray eyes, "I have an old score to settle with that knave. Taking his spoils would make it that much sweeter." Gulping the last of his drink, Graves stood and adjusted his silver-buckled sword-belt. "Have the men ready the ship," he said. "We leave as soon as Hell's Fury is out of sight." "Aye, Captain," replied the first mate. 2. The sun's golden disk had just shed its first light over the shimmering blue waters when Hell's Fury heaved up its anchor and cast off. Hidden aboard Sea Rover, Graves and his crew watching silently from across the foggy harbor. They made no move to follow. Instead, they watched patiently as Hell's Fury crested the horizon and vanished. At that instant, Captain Graves shouted orders to raise anchor and set sail. A short time later, Sea Rover had broken out of the harbor and into open waters with full sails. At the helm, Graves kept the ship on course and its speed steady as to not overtake his enemy. The captain was no fool. He well knew that Kilrin was shrewd and suspicious as a wolf and twice as cunning. He might well suspect that a rival would follow. As a precaution, Graves kept a sharp-eyed lookout in the crow's nest, with orders to shout a warning if a ship or an island were spotted. For 3 days they sailed, seeing naught but the sweeping, wind-swept ocean and nameless sea life that surfaced to investigate the intruders. It was just past midpoint of the 4th day when a shout from the crow's nest broke the relative silence. "Land, Captain!" yelled the lookout excitedly, pointing to the blue-tinged horizon. "An island, dead ahead!" The crew rushed to the railings, peering at the far-off island that was little more than a speck on the horizon. Roused by the watchman's cry, Captain Graves and Kylan emerged from the captain's quarters. At first glance, the island seemed bigger than Graves had anticipated, though at their present distance it was difficult to judge the size or make out any other details. Turning, he faced his crew. "Prepare yourselves for a fight, you bullies. If that dog is anchored, we will ram his ship and cut him to pieces. If he is on the island, we will lay in wait and feather him and his crew full of arrow." Glancing up at the crow's nest, Graves hollered to the watchman. "Let me know as soon as you see Kilrin's ship." "Aye, Captain," replied the lookout. Back in his quarters, Graves donned a stout coat of gray chainmail armor over a leather shirt. Having been fashioned in the city of Kim by a metalsmith of great skill and fame, he knew that the armor could turn away all but the fiercest blows. Being of such fine craftsmanship, the hauberk had cost him a stack of gold coins. "A small price to pay," he thought, "if it sees me through a fight with Kilrin and his crew of cutthroats." Around his waist he fastened his silver-buckled sword-belt where hung his jewel-hilted cutlass. Breeks made of fine leather and high-topped seaman's boots fashioned from buckskin completed his outfit. On the deck, the crew had prepared for battle. Most of the men had put on hauberks of heavy chainmail or thick padded leather armor and buckled on extra weapons. Longbows had been strung and quivers of long arrows were at the ready. "No sign of Hell's Fury," said the lookout as Graves emerged from his cabin. Glancing at the island, he could see that they were now much closer. "Mayhap Kilrin decided to anchor on the far side of the island," remarked Kylan. Graves said nothing for a moment as he regarded the island suspiciously, his gray eyes smoldering. "Or perhaps he is—" His words were abruptly cut off by a shout from the lookout. "Ship, Captain! Starboard side! It's Hell's Fury headed straight for us!" All eyes turned as one to the approaching ship, which was just coming around the far side of the island. With full sails and all oars rowing, the war galley was at full speed, cutting through the water like a razor-edged knife. "I might have known that dog was up to something," the captain growled. A string of profanity followed as he cursed himself as a fool. That swine has circled the island and come around." Killoran was right to have suspected that he might be followed, and now Graves and his men were at a disadvantage. "Quickly!" shouted Graves. "Turn the ship! All hands to the oars! We will face him head-on!" As both vessels raced towards each other, their long oars rose and fell in unison, and thus began a series of strategic maneuvers as each ship tried to gain the upper hand. However, it was Killoran's ship with its greater advantage of speed and positioning that eventually won out. As Hell's Fury came on like an unstoppable juggernaut, the two ships exchanged volleys of arrows, and men went down screaming and clutching at long shafts. Yet Captain Graves knew that arrows would have little effect. There was no stopping Hell's Fury. Tossing aside his bow, he gripped Sea Rover's thick wooden railing. "Brace for impact!" he bellowed. The splintering of timber was deafening as Hell's Fury slammed its massive bronze ram into the side of Sea Rover, crushing its planking and breaching the hull. The terrific impact sent men sprawling across the deck like leaves blown before a storm. Recovering from the violent collision, Graves could see that his ship was mortally wounded as it began to take on torrents of seawater. He also knew they had only one chance for survival. They must take Hell's Fury. "Up and at 'em!" boomed Graves, his voice rising above the grinding of lumber and crashing of waves. "We must take their ship before they cut our throats!" The captain's words spurred his men to frantic action. Brandishing their weapons, they rose with an earth-shaking roar and swarmed to meet their enemy. In an instant, both ships were a veritable tornado of stabbing knives and hacking swords. Blood from severed limbs, spilled entrails, and split skulls splattered the decks in a riot of red fury. And as the fighting raged, it reached a crescendo, with the screams of the dying mingling with the clashing of weapons in a grotesque song of violence. It had been a tough fight, thought Graves, a fight Killoran had nearly won, and though he was loath to do so, he had to give credit to his enemy's skills. The dog knew his ship well and the sea better. His thoughts then abruptly turned to the bitter feud that had existed between the two captains, a feud that had festered like an open wound for years. Both men had been smitten with a voluptuous, sultry-eyed dancing girl named Vessa. But it was in the arms of Graves that she found solace. A man given easily to emotions and black moods of melancholy, Killoran confronted Graves, and in a fit of jealous rage he drew his sword and the two captains came to savage blows. In the ensuing fight, Killoran smote Graves a terrific blow with the pommel of his sword, laying his scalp open and knocking him senseless. Thinking he had killed his enemy, Killoran turned his wrath on Vessa, and in a mad rage he cut her down. Over the subsequent years, Graves had sought to avenge Vessa's murder, and the two captains had crossed swords more than once. However, they were never able to end the conflict until today. A splash of cold seawater brought Graves out of his reverie. Nearing the shore, he jumped out of the dinghy. The frigid water took his breath away momentarily, and the salt stung his wounds. With some effort, he managed to pull the little boat onto the beach and tie it to a large piece of driftwood. Graves eyed the brooding jungle. Though he was a city-bred man, the pirate instinctively felt that it was dangerous. He had spent far too much time as a thief and pirate and among cutthroats and ruffians to mistake the feeling of menace. Sensing danger was as second nature to him as it was to an animal. Loosening his knife in its scabbard, Graves cautiously strode into the dense emerald jungle, following what looked to be an old path. So thick was the vine-covered foliage that little of the sun's rays were able to penetrate the canopy. This lack of light and warmth gave the place an eerie, heavy feeling and an overwhelming odor of damp decay. Graves had not gone far when unexpectedly a rustling sound among the trees stopped him in his tracks. Crouching instinctively, he withdrew behind a massive tree as he slid his Zajar knife from its leather sheath. Tense moments passed, when suddenly, out of a leafy tangle of vines stepped three fantastical figures, the likes of which Graves had never seen. The things were unnaturally tall, and would have easily towered head and shoulders over the tall pirate. Their limbs were long, covered in smooth lean muscles and brownish-green skin like that of a long dead corpse. About their waists they wore loincloths made of animal hide, and their wrists and necks were adorned with beaten bands of glinting gold. All three were armed with long, bronze-tipped spears gripped in their talon-like hands. However, it was their faces that sent a chill through the captain. Their heads were large, with elongated jaws, high protruding cheekbones, and broad, flat noses. Overall, their countenance had a hint of the reptilian about it. This was particularly prominent in their lipless mouths, large yellow eyes, and dark, slitted pupils. The sight of the unexpected things came as a surprise to the pirate, who believed the island to be uninhabited. Having visited many exotic lands over the years, Graves had encountered a variety of bizarre and unusual creatures, but none as uncanny or as abhorrent as these. Typically a man of unshakable nerves, Graves was a bit uneasy and nonplussed at the sight of the devilish beings. For a few seconds he felt an irresistible urge to run, to be free of the stifling, fiend-haunted island. But now his curiosity was roused, and it held him in check. With iron control, he calmed himself. The creatures, unaware of his presence, meandered along the trail, and Graves, making no more sound than a stalking panther, glided after them. In his youth, the pirate had worked as a guild thief in the city of Kem, where he'd mastered the art of stealth while prowling dark alleys and robbing slumbering noblemen. That skill now served him well. Graves followed the creatures deeper into the interior of the jungle to an area where the snaky wilderness suddenly parted, giving way to a wide, open expanse. Hiding himself behind a cluster of vine-covered bushes, he watched furtively as the tall creatures entered a large courtyard-like area, carpeted in lush green grass. From his hiding spot, he could see the skeleton-like remains of an ancient city, and he knew that this was the once mighty kingdom of Rama. Now that castellated empire sat in crumbling ruins. The once magnificent spire-topped towers and columned temples of gray stone lay in vine-covered heaps. Yet among that desolation there stood a curiously made tower that contrasted vividly with the jungle's lush greenery. Entirely black in color, it rose 150 feet like a great black monolith, unlike anything that Graves had ever seen. It had been into this tower, through a high arched doorway, that the reptilian creatures had went. The structure appeared to be built entirely of a dull, black obsidian-like stone, but nowhere could the captain spot any places where stone blocks were fit together. Instead, the cylindrical walls of the structure were smooth, as if the entire thing had been fashioned out of a single piece of stone. Adding to this oddity were the strange, esoteric symbols that had been intricately carved into the tower's dark surface. There were hundreds of these cryptic carvings, each one varying from the next, and covering nearly the entire face of the tower. Graves had seen many curious writings and odd hieroglyphs during his far travels, but none so unusual. These had an unfamiliar preternatural aspect to them, something alien that the pirate had never before encountered. He felt that their origins may have gone back to the gray dawn of time immemorial, or perhaps they were not of this world at all. The latter was a revelation that brought beads of clammy sweat to his forehead. One thing the pirate felt sure of was that no human hands had crafted that sinister tower. As these thoughts raced through the captain's mind, he was filled with an ominous feeling about the tower. And again he felt the overwhelming desire to flee the island. Moreover, the tower seemed to have a hypnotic quality about it, and Graves found that staring at it too long made his vision swim and his head hurt. Pulling his eyes away, his attention was then drawn to a large stone fire pit, and beyond that, across the courtyard, a number of long wooden poles that had been driven into the ground. And much to the pirate's bewilderment, tied to these poles were a group of 20 or so ragged-looking men that appeared to be pirates. Like a phantom, Graves stole furtively through the trees, skirting the broad courtyard until he came into direct line with the captured pirates. Concealed by the thick jungle, Graves was able to get within just a few yards. At this vantage point, he could now see them in greater detail. Much to his surprise, he recognized several of the men, and knew that they were the crew of the Red Hand. Yet he was a little bothered. He knew that the crew was more than twice what he counted, and nowhere among them did he spot their captain. He could also see that they were in pitiful shape, blood-stained and haggard, with a few wounded well-nigh unto death. Peering at their faces, Graves recognized one of the men as Chambers, a fellow pirate he had caroused with on a number of occasions. Glancing around the courtyard showed no signs of the tall creatures. In a hushed voice he called to Chambers. The pirate looked up instantly in wide-eyed amazement at the sound of his name. A moment later, his bloodshot eyes focused on a face staring at him from a copse of leafy green shrubbery. "Captain Graves!" exclaimed Chambers in disbelief. "How is it that you are here?" The pirate's voice roused several of the other men who sat near, and likewise they stared in surprise, but remained silent. With a wave of his hand, Graves motioned the pirate to silence. "That is a long story," he said in a hushed voice. "First, tell me how it is that you are here. I never expected to find anything but crumbling ruins and moldering bones on this island. And where is your captain and the rest of your mates?" "All dead, slain by those devilish things," said Chambers, motioning with his head towards the dark tower. "We were ambushed 2 days ago as we came to shore. We put up a mighty fight, and sent more than a few of them to hell. But those devils are not like men. They have the vitality of a bull and are harder to kill. We here were captured. But it is worse than you know, Captain. Those things are diabolical." His voice fell to just above a whisper, and a look of fear danced in his eyes. "I tell you that they are not of this world. Just look at yonder tower, that was never touched by human hands." For a moment Chambers fell silent as the two pirates gazed at the tower. Then, in a voice shaking with terror, he said, "There is one more thing, Captain. They possess a dark thing, a fiend from the depth of the blackest pits of hell." Chambers hesitated for a moment as an involuntary shudder shook him. Graves, knowing that Chambers was a stout man, not easily given to fear, was surprised to see him affected so. "They have a thing that they summon," he continued. "From a strange black orb it grows, a dark monstrosity. For 2 nights now they have held rituals, letting it feed off of us." Chambers closed his eyes as if trying to block out a terrible image. "You must get us out of here," he said in a pleading voice that trembled with fright. I intend to," replied Graves. "But tell me, where is the Red Hand?" "It is anchored on the other side of the island, miles from here," answered Chambers. "Now, tell me, Captain," said Chambers, his eyes nervously darting to the tower, "before those devils return, how is it that you came here?" "I followed that dog Killerin, who in turn must have followed you. I learned that he had found the location of this island from one of his spies. It's clear to me now that he meant to cut all of your throats and take the loot for himself. But, of course," said Graves nonchalantly, "I intended to do the same to him. But alas, he discovered that I was on his tail, and now my ship is sunken, and both crews are at the bottom of the ocean feeding the fish." "And what of Killerin?" asked Chambers. "That knave died on the end of my blade, and the debt of vengeance has been exacted," replied Graves. "And what about his ship?" said Chambers. "I fear the Red Hand is too far away. Those devils would track us down ere we could get halfway across the island." "Hell's Fury is anchored not far from here." Hearing this news, Chambers noticeably perked up. It was at that moment that the tall creatures issued forth from the black tower, holding flickering torches. Fearful of being spotted, Graves withdrew into the shadowy bushes, whispering, I will return later." In single file, they approached the great fire pit, tossing their torches in. The pile of dried wood caught quickly, and a blazing fire flared to life, sending shadows writhing across the courtyard as if they were living things. For a time, Graves digested all that Chambers had told him as he watched the reptilian things. Evidently, they were preparing for their ritual as night was rapidly approaching. Sometime later, the full moon began to rise over the trees, casting an eerie gray glow onto the courtyard as darkness settled over the island. As the fire leapt and flickered in the stone pit, one of the creatures untied a young pirate and dragged him bodily across the courtyard. Graves could see that the fellow was in bad shape. Blood soaked his leather jerkin, and his head lolled limply on his shoulders. To a long pole near the fire pit, the hapless pirate was fettered. Lifting his arms above his head, the creature secured his bound wrists to a brass metal hook and left him hanging limply. A quick glance at the other pirates showed Graves that none of them were watching the proceedings. Instead, they sat in mute silence, with their heads cast down and their eyes closed tightly. His attention was then drawn back to the tower. From it came another of the creatures that appeared to be the leader or chieftain. Slightly taller than the others, it wore an ornately carved golden headpiece that shone brightly in the light of the fire. Around its waist was a thin belt. From that belt hung a pouch made of animal skin, and next to that hung a long, sharp-tipped dagger. It was a blade unlike any that Graves had ever seen. The entire thing, including the hilt, was made of a black metal that gleamed dully. As the chieftain approached, the other 7 formed a half-circle around the blazing fire pit. Stopping a few yards in front of the bound pirate, the chieftain pulled from its pouch a dark orb. This the creature rose above its head, and in a throaty language that resounded through the courtyard it spoke strange words. At the sound of those guttural words, the bound pirate opened his glazed eyes and struggled weakly at his bonds. Seeing the man struggle in fear, Graves closed his hand tightly on the hilt of his sword. The iron muscles along his forearm quivered, and the knuckles of his hands turning white. He wished to draw the weapon and burst onto the courtyard and smite those reptilian devils. But he knew that it would be suicide. All he could do was watch helplessly. As the chieftain's guttural words faded, he suddenly rolled the dark orb towards the bound pirate. And as it rolled, it rapidly grew in size, and before the pirate's bewildered eyes, a transmutation took place. From that sphere there suddenly rose an anthropomorphic shape out of nightmares and madness, a great black entity. The blood congealed in the captain's veins as he looked at that monstrosity. It was man-like in shape, but grotesquely malformed and entirely black, a black so deep that it seemed to absorb light. Short, thickly bowed legs and unnaturally long arms ended in cruel hook-like hands, and its face was featureless without a nose or mouth. Where the eyes should have been, there were bulbous-like protrusions that seemed to swirl. These weird, orb-like eyes were distinctively glossier than the dull black of the thing's skin, if indeed it could be called skin. For the entity didn't seem to have skin. Instead, its entire body appeared to be made of a viscous-like substance, not flesh and bone. Graves knew that what he gazed upon was not of this world, but instead a fiend from beyond the realm of man, a being from another plane of existence. Transfixed, he watched in revulsion as the dark horror shambled toward the bound pirate. Grabbing hold of the man, it gazed into his eyes. For a moment the pirate struggled vainly and cried out shrilly and was then still. What happened next brought beads of clammy sweat to Graves's forehead and made the hairs on the nape of his neck to stand up. The captain watched as the pirate's body slowly began to shrivel and become gaunt, the color draining from his face as his skin withered. It was apparent to the pirate that the entity was feeding off of the man's essence, taking his very soul. Repulsed, yet unable to look away, he watched as the entity drained its victim. Having finished with its gruesome feeding, the entity turned away from the pirate. Though killed only scant seconds ago, the emaciated body resembled a withered corpse that Graves had once seen in an ancient tomb. Accustomed to death, Graves had seen his share of dead bodies, both fresh and old, but never had he seen one that wore such a visage of absolute horror. Graves's attention was then drawn back to the entity. The thing stood facing the chieftain, and as he watched, the chieftain gripped the hilt of the black dagger and spoke unknown words in a commanding tone. Almost instantly, the entity began to shrink, as its viscous body flowed and transmuted once more into an orb. Stooping, the chieftain retrieved the sphere and placed it back into the pouch. It then issued a croaking command and strode toward the tower. In single file, the others followed their leader into the dark tower, and all was silent in the shadowy, moonlit courtyard. 3. Not knowing how much time he had, or if the creatures would return at all, Graves sprang into action. Leaping from among the dense trees and into the courtyard, he knelt next to Chambers and quickly severed his bonds. Handing the pirate his ajar knife, he said, "Hurry, we must get everyone free before those devils come back. We can make a run for the boat. It's our only chance." Frantically, the two pirates began freeing their comrades. As chance would have it, the bulk of their weapons had been left in a pile not more than a few yards from where they had been tied. As each man was freed, they scrambled to gather up swords, knives, and daggers. All but 2 of the pirates had been set free, when suddenly a guttural caterwauling tore through the courtyard. Wheeling, Graves could see that the reptilian things had emerged from the tower and were racing across the courtyard at full speed. And as they came on irresistibly, he could see at the lead was their chieftain. The men, crazed with hatred for their tormentors, brandished their weapons and charged like a pack of blood-mad wolves, heedless of those terrible claws. Few of them hoped to survive, but they desperately desired to wreak as much red havoc on their foes as they could before they fell. Leading the charge, Graves ran directly at the leader, his sword held high. With frightening speed, the chieftain struck at the captain, its claws tearing through rings of armor as if they were paper and ripping the flesh underneath. Springing aside, Graves countered his foe's attack, striking like a thunderbolt. His blade, sweeping in a terrific arch, flashed like blue fire in the moonlight as it hummed down. With all the power of his broad shoulders behind it, the cutlass sheared through flesh and bone, and the chieftain reeled back, jetting yellow blood from its half-severed neck. So fierce was the blow that it would have lopped off the head of any normal man, but the sinewy muscles and bones of these creatures were unnaturally tough. As the chieftain's blood flowed down his chest in great rivulets, it reached into its pouch and withdrew the dark orb. Seeing this, Graves lifted his cutlass to strike the creature, but it was too late. As the chieftain fell in his death throes, the orb rolled from his clawed hand, and before the pirate stood the dark entity. Looming before Graves, the entity spread its great misshapen arms as it shambled towards him. Galvanized to instant action, he dashed in under those long arms, slashing murderously at the thing's midsection, his blade cutting a deep swath through the fiend's viscous-like body. Such was the cut that it would have gutted any living man, but the entity took little notice as the great wound simply closed before the pirate's astonished eyes. And then it was on him. In desperation, Graves attempted to leap back out of the way, but it was too late. Those terrible arms had encircled him like the coils of a python, and its talons ripped through armor and flesh. Struggling to get free, Graves took a few steps back, dragging the thing with him, and in doing so stumbled over the prostrate body of the chieftain. Together, the two combatants crashed to the ground in a thrashing heap. At that moment, the thing bent its face towards Graves, and their eyes locked. Gazing into those swirling orbs of ultimate blackness, Graves was instantly consumed. And with a sudden rush, he felt as if he were being swept across nighted gulfs and vast chasms of cosmic time and space. In that black void, he could feel the entity's negative energy sapping his strength and soul, like a vampire sucking the blood from its nightly victim. The pirate then became conscious of lights, pinpoints of wispy lights that shone like stars in the darkness, thousands of them. And in that moment, he was assailed with a sickening realization. He knew that they were mortal souls tormented and trapped within the dark entity. Graves knew then that the creature was a vile abomination, and what he looked upon was a blasphemous perversion of nature. Locked in that hypnotic gaze, Graves knew had to look away, or he would join those souls, trapped in that dark, abysmal thing forever. Presently, the sounds of screaming men and hacking swords momentarily brought the captain back to reality. It was all he needed. With a great effort, he pulled his eyes away from those magnetic orbs and closed them tightly. Despite being free of that awful gaze, Graves could feel that the entity was still draining his soul. This realization sent a wave of panic and fear surging through his body like a wildfire, lending him strength. With an effort that strained his muscles to their limits and tore a grunt from his throat, he pulled his arm free from the entity's crushing embrace. Not daring to open his eyes lest he meet the thing's gaze, he groped blindly for anything he could grab and use as a weapon. As more of the pirate's strength was sapped and blackness threatened to overtake him, he suddenly felt the familiar form of a hilt and dimly comprehended that it was the strange black blade that the chieftain carried in his belt. In desperation, he yanked the weapon free of its sheath and sank it to the hilt in the dark monstrosity. The creature writhed in obvious pain, and its crushing grip slackened. Again he stabbed, feeling the black dagger tear through the glutinous flesh. This time the fiend released its hold and sought to pull away. With the last of his waning strength, Graves lunged upwards, furiously plunging the sharp blade into the black body as darkness once again consumed him. It was the sound of a far-off voice and being roughly shaken that brought Graves back to painful reality. "Captain Graves," said the familiar voice of Chambers, "do you live?" With an effort, Graves opened his eyes to see several pirates clustered about him. I live," he replied in a voice that was strained and hoarse. "No thanks to that black brute. The damnable thing nearly sucked the life out of me." It was then that the captain realized he still grasped the strange black dagger. "If it wasn't for this," he said, glancing at the blade, "that devil would have finished me off." "And what of that black monster?" said Graves. "Did it run off?" "No," replied Chambers. "It went back into a sphere and rolled to the tower where it disappeared." With an effort, Graves stood up, swaying a bit before he found his balance. Glancing around, he could see that the courtyard resembled a battlefield. By the light of the glowing moon, he could see the lush green sward was strewn with mangled bodies and stained with red and yellow blood. The captain could see that all the reptilian creatures had been killed, and only 9 of the pirates had survived that terrible onslaught of ripping claws. His attention then turned to the tower as a strange booming noise issued forth from it. Looking up, Graves could see it silhouetted against the moonlight, but now it was wreathed in a weird, dark luminosity that pulsed rhythmically with a deep, booming sound. "What do you make of that?" asked Chambers nervously as he glanced at the dark tower. "I don't know," replied Graves, "but I don't like the looks of it." As he gazed, a feeling of foreboding and menace crept into him. His perturbations were not unwarranted, for as he watched, he realized that the booming was increasing in volume and frequency, and the dark radiance was spreading. And in that moment, there came a sudden and terrifying comprehension. "That thing is going to blow like a volcano," said the captain. Turning, he faced the group and began barking out orders in an authoritative voice. As was his nature, Graves had instinctively assumed command, and the pirates followed without question. "Quickly," he ordered, "grab some of that burning wood for torches so we can find our way through the jungle." Hurriedly, the men gathered some makeshift torches as the booming grew louder. Spotting the path he had used earlier, Graves shouted, "Follow me!" And though he was still weakened by his encounter with the dark entity, he gritted his teeth and led his men at a dead run through the dark, tangled maze of vines. With only the light from their feeble torches to guide them, they tripped and stumbled over roots and rotting tree trunks. Lifting any who fell, Graves and Chambers shoved them forward, cursing them to greater speed. Beaten and half torn to pieces as they were, they ran. And as they ran, they splattered blood with every step, and the pulsing sound continued to grow ever louder, reverberating through the hellish nighttime jungle. Panic-stricken with fear by the incessant drumming, the group called on their last reserves of strength as they plunged wildly ahead on that mad flight. And then suddenly they burst out of the dark jungle and onto the bright, moonlit beach. With chests heaving and limbs quivering and burning from their exertions, the group stopped for a moment as they gasped for air. Graves, spotting the dinghy, ran to it and swiftly cut the rope that moored it to the driftwood. "Hurry!" he bellowed, his voice nearly drowned out by the ceaseless booming. "Into the water!" Despite their exhaustion, they grabbed hold of the craft and pulled it stumbling down the beach and into the crashing waves. Glancing over his shoulder, Graves could see that the dark radiance had risen above the treetops, and the booming sound was like that of 1,000 drums beating in unison. Piling into the small craft, the pirates began to paddle frantically with hands and oars through the crashing waves and over the swells that sparkled with moonlight. And then suddenly there came a sound like that of a mighty thunderclap that shook the island like an earthquake to its very core. This was followed by a great blast that splintered and uprooted trees as if they were mere twigs. And a great flash of inky darkness spread over the island, obscuring everything. So great was the blast that it nearly toppled the small craft as bits and pieces of trees splashed about them and the ocean churned violently. A few moments later, a calmness returned and the darkness that covered the island receded. In the light of the full moon, the men could see Hell's Fury outlined by moonlight as it rocked and swayed on the choppy ocean. A few quick pulls on the oars and the men were clambering up the rope ladders. Once on board, the exhausted crew collapsed to the deck, and it was a long while before anyone roused. The next morning, as the sun was spilling its golden rays over the shimmering blue ocean, Hell's Fury was heading towards the open sea, with a strong breeze filling her great sails. The crew, having been nearly starved to death while captive, had broken into the stores of food below deck, where they feasted and drank. And now, after a night's rest and with their bellies full, and their wounds bandaged, they had regained much of their strength. Atop the poop deck, Graves and Chambers watched as the island receded into the hazy distance. "What do you think happened to that black monster?" asked Chambers. For a moment Graves did not answer as he pondered the question. "It could be that it was blown to pieces along with that tower," he mused. "Or mayhap it crawled back to whatever dark world it slunk from. One thing I know for sure, if that devil lives, it has some wounds to lick before it thinks of coming back." The captain then took a drink from his jug of rum. Though battered, sore, and nearly torn to pieces, he was in fine spirits and grinned lustily. Chambers, noticing the grin, remarked, "You seem happy for a man who has lost a ship and a crew and has nothing to show for it." "Aye, you are right," he replied. "But the dead are dead, and what has happened is past. As for a ship and a crew, I have both right here. And we can always find more willing men." "Well, Captain, where to, then?" "Back to the city of Kem," replied Graves. "I've had a belly full of devil-haunted islands and black entities. I'm for a bit of carousing and some honest piracy. What say you, Chambers? Will you join me?" "Aye, Captain," said Chambers with a wide grin. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed The Dark Entity, please hit the like button and subscribe so you know when the next story is released.